The midday sun hit the Baywater waterfront like a punishment. Talia Raines didn't stop walking. She had been dragging the mattress for 11 blocks through cracked sidewalks, past shuttered storefronts, through the thick salt air that clung to everything in this part of the city. Her arms burned. Her shoes were wrong for this. None of it mattered. The mattress was the last decent thing she owned, and Kira was going to sleep on something soft tonight, even if it killed her mother getting it there. Cars slowed. People stared. Nobody stopped. Behind her, a black SUV had been trailing at a crawl for the last 2 blocks. The man inside, Adrian Crew, one of the most powerful real estate developers on the eastern seaboard, had told his driver to pass her 3 times. 3 times something made him hesitate. Then Talia turned. She pushed through a rusted iron gate at the end of Juniper Row and disappeared inside a building Adrian hadn't looked at in years. A weathered wooden sign hung above the entrance, the letters faded but still legible. Maribel House, his mother's name. Adrian's hand was already on the door handle before he knew what he was doing. If this is your first time here, stories like this one are what this channel is built on. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Adrian Crew had not been back to Baywater in 6 years. That was intentional. He had grown up in these streets, the salt-warped row houses, the fish-smell mornings, the way poverty had a specific sound here, which was the sound of nothing breaking because nothing worked well enough to break. He had left at 19 with a scholarship, a duffel bag, and a decision so firm it had never required revisiting. He was not coming back. He came back anyway, just not the way he'd imagined. The Crew Harbor Waterfront project was the largest development his company had ever undertaken. A $340 million transformation of the old Baywater industrial docks into luxury residential towers, boutique retail, and a marina that would, according to the press materials, breathe new life into a long-neglected coastal corridor. The language was good. His communications team was good. What the press materials did not say was that the neglected coastal corridor had people in it, and those people were being pushed incrementally outward, block by block, the way water finds the lowest ground. Adrian knew this. He had stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about the sound of traffic, not because it went away, but because you needed to function. He was in the back of the SUV reviewing revised permit documents when he first noticed her. A woman. Black mid-30s dressed in work clothes that had seen too many long shifts. She was moving a mattress down the sidewalk alone, not carrying it exactly, but dragging one end while the other scraped against the concrete. Her body angled forward like someone leaning into a wind that wasn't there. She moved with the focused, economical effort of a person who had already used up every available option and was now simply executing the only one left. "Drive around her," Adrian said. His driver, a quiet man named Russell, who had worked for him for 9 years, eased the SUV into the adjacent lane. They pulled alongside the woman. Adrian didn't look up from his documents. Then something made him look up. It wasn't her struggle that stopped him. He had seen struggle in Baywater his whole life and had trained himself not to let it interrupt forward motion. What stopped him was something subtler, the absolute absence of performance in how she moved. She wasn't looking around for help. She wasn't making eye contact with passing cars. She was simply moving the mattress, as though the only thing that existed in the entire world was the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. "Slow down," he said. Russell slowed. The woman reached the end of Juniper Row and turned without hesitating, pushing through a rusted iron gate with her shoulder while dragging the mattress behind her. The gate groaned, but opened. Adrian watched her disappear inside. Then he saw the sign. Maribel House. The words hit him somewhere below the chest. He sat very still for a moment in the back of the air-conditioned SUV, the permit documents sliding off his knee onto the seat beside him. "Stop the car!" Talia Raines had learned not to trust the first 5 seconds of any new space. You walked in, you assessed exits, sight lines, the smell of the place, whether the floors felt solid. It was a habit she'd developed not from paranoia, but from necessity. When you moved through as many temporary situations as she had in the past 4 months, You learned quickly that available and safe were two different categories, and assuming otherwise cost you. Maribel House smelled like closed rooms and old wood, and something underneath that something that might have been lavender once a long time ago. The front hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling at the seams, but the floors were solid. The windows were intact. The roof, as far as she could tell, was holding. It would do. Mavis O'Neill had pressed the key into her hand that morning at the Community Services office on Delacroix Street. The elderly woman had explained the situation in the careful, unhurried way of someone who had navigated bureaucracies long enough to understand which details mattered. The building was technically under a pending demolition order, but the original deed contained a community use clause that had never been formally revoked. A clause stipulating that any woman confirmed homeless by a recognized community organization retained the right to temporary residency pending legal review. Mavis had spent 30 years in this neighborhood. She had known Maribel Crew not closely, but well enough. She knew what the building was, what it had been built to do, and what it would mean if it disappeared without anyone walking through its doors one last time. Before Talia left that morning, Mavis had held her hand a beat longer than necessary. "That building deserves someone walking through it," she had said quietly. "More than it deserves standing empty." Talia hadn't known what to make of that. She'd tucked the key into her pocket and gone to get Kira's mattress from storage. She was setting it against the wall of the main room when she heard the front gate. She turned. The man standing in the doorway was not what she expected a building inspector to look like. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a suit that cost more than 3 months of her last paycheck. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't reaching for a phone. He was just standing there, staring at something on the wall behind her, and whatever was on his face wasn't anger. It was something she didn't have a word for yet. Talia positioned herself between him and the hallway. "This is a lawful residency," she said. Her voice was even. She had practiced even. "I have documentation from the Baywater Community Services office confirming my right to temporary occupancy under the existing deed clause. If you're here to dispute that, you can contact—" "That's my mother," he said. She stopped. He was looking at a photograph on the far wall, a framed picture she had noticed earlier and set aside as background detail. A woman older, standing in front of this same building, smiling in the unself-conscious way of someone who didn't think about being photographed because she had more important things to think about. "That photograph," he said more quietly. "That's my mother. This was her house." The silence in the room changed texture. Talia didn't lower her guard, but she watched him cross the room slowly and stop in front of the photograph, and she saw something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized without wanting to. The particular stillness of a person confronting something they had been successfully not thinking about for a very long time. He didn't touch the photograph. He just looked at it. "The demolition order," he said finally, still not looking at her. "It goes through tomorrow morning." "I know," Talia said. "You knew and you came anyway." "I had a key and a legal right," she said, "and my daughter needed somewhere to sleep." He turned then and looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the way people had been looking at her all day on the street with that particular mixture of pity and discomfort, but with something more direct than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. He didn't introduce himself. She didn't ask. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting, and neither of them moved toward the door. He came back the next morning with coffee he hadn't asked if she wanted. That was the first mistake. Talia was in the kitchen when she heard the front door. She had propped it open to move air through the ground floor, and she came out to find Adrian Crew standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups from a place on Harbor Street that charged $8 for drip coffee. He held one out to her with the automatic confidence of a man accustomed to gestures landing well. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. "I don't need coffee," she said. "I need to know if you're here to start the process of removing me." He set both cups on the narrow hallway table. "I'm not." "Then why are you here?" He didn't have a clean answer for that. She could see him reach for one and come up short, which she noted as either honesty or a more sophisticated form of strategy. She hadn't decided which. "I looked into the deed clause last night," he said. "Mavis O'Neill filed the documentation correctly. Your occupancy is legally defensible. I know, Talia said. That's why I'm here. He nodded. Then he said, I want to help. There it was. She had been waiting for it since the moment she'd seen the suit. Talia leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms, not from hostility, but from the particular weariness of a person who had heard that sentence enough times to know the shape of what came after it. Help how? She said. It wasn't a question. I have a property on the north side, 2-bedroom, fully furnished, vacant since January. You and your daughter could move in today. I'll cover the first 6 months. After that, we could work out. No. He stopped. I also know a placement service that works with families in transitional housing, and I can make a call this afternoon that would... Mr. Crew. He stopped again. Talia looked at him steadily. You walked in here yesterday, and the first thing you did was offer to move me somewhere else. This morning you came back, and the first thing you did was offer to move me somewhere else. You haven't asked me one question. You haven't asked what I need, what my daughter needs, what we've already tried, or why I'm standing in a building with a demolition order instead of one of the dozen other options you seem to think exist. She paused. Let that sit. People like you always think a check makes it clean. Write the number big enough and the problem goes away and everybody gets to feel good about how it ended. But my daughter doesn't need one night in a furnished apartment. She needs to know that the place she wakes up tomorrow is going to be there the day after. She's 7 years old and she's already learned not to unpack all the way. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The hallway was very quiet. Adrian looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the table. He looked at the floor. Then he looked back at her and said with a directness she hadn't expected, No, I don't fully, but I'm starting to. It wasn't the right answer. It was an honest one. He stayed. Not in the house, he wasn't that oblivious, but he didn't leave Baywater. He made calls from the parking lot of a hardware store 2 blocks away, and by mid-afternoon he had postponed the demolition order through a procedural review request that would hold for 72 hours. It wasn't a solution. It was time. Then he went back to the office and started pulling files. The Maribel House property had been absorbed into the Crew Harbor Development portfolio 4 years ago, processed by the legal team as part of a bulk acquisition of Baywater parcels. Adrian had signed off on the portfolio without reviewing individual properties. It was 230 pages of documents, and he had a company to run. His signature was on page 187. But when he pulled the original deed filed in the county recorder's office in 1987, he found something the legal team had apparently decided was too inconvenient to bring to his attention. His mother had written the community use clause herself, in language that was unusual for a deed of that era, direct, specific, and grounded in personal conviction rather than legal boilerplate. The clause stipulated that the property at 14 Juniper Row was to be maintained in perpetuity as a place of refuge for women and children in crisis, and that no transfer of title shall supersede the right of such persons to temporary shelter therein so long as the community need exists. The clause had been flagged by his legal team 6 years ago. A memo in the file authored by Graham Sutter described it as a legacy encumbrance with limited enforceability under current property law, and recommended processing it through standard title clearance. The memo had been approved. Adrian's initials were in the margin. He sat with that for a long time. He hadn't known. That was true. He also hadn't asked. That was also true. In his experience, those 2 facts were not as different as people like to believe. Not knowing was often just a more comfortable name for not looking. His mother had written that clause. She had put it in legal language and recorded it at the county courthouse because she knew, with the practical wisdom of a woman who had spent decades watching the neighborhood she loved get dismantled piece by piece, that intentions without paperwork meant nothing when the money arrived. And he had signed paperwork that erased it. He closed the file. He picked up his phone and called Graham Sutter. "We need to talk about Maribel House," he said. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough to tell him everything about how that conversation was going to go. Graham Sutter had been with Crew Harbor for 14 years. He was efficient, unsentimentally intelligent, and possessed of a quality Adrian had always valued. He never wasted time on problems that couldn't be solved by better process. He arrived at Adrian's office within 20 minutes, sat down without being invited to, and spent 45 seconds reviewing the deed excerpt Adrian slid across the desk before setting it aside. "The legal team cleared this," Graham said, "by reclassifying a permanent community use clause as a legacy encumbrance," Adrian said. "That's not clearing it, that's ignoring it. It's the same outcome." "It's not the same thing." Graham studied him with the measured patience of a man who had navigated his share of executive sentiment episodes and knew how to wait them out. "Adrian, the woman in that building is a sympathetic case. I understand that. But we cannot restructure a $340 million development around a sympathetic case. If we set this precedent, every parcel in the portfolio becomes vulnerable to the same argument." "My mother wrote that clause," Adrian said. "I know. She recorded it at the county courthouse in 1987 because she knew people would try to ignore it." Graham leaned back. His voice had gone carefully flat. "We cannot let every exceptional case become a reason to stop an entire project. If we did, we'd never build anything." Adrian looked at him. The sentence landed with a recognition he hadn't expected. Not anger, but something quieter. He had said those exact words, or words that meant the same thing more times than he could count. He had said them in boardrooms and on site visits and over contract dinners, and they had always sounded like clarity. Sitting across from Graham now, hearing them come back at him, he understood for the first time what they actually were. Not clarity. Habit. The practiced fluency of a man who had learned to succeed by not seeing certain things. "Give me 72 hours, Adrian said. "Don't touch the building." Graham stood. His expression had closed. 72 hours, he said, "and then we proceed." He left without another word. Adrian already knew Graham would not wait 72 hours. He had seen the calculation happen behind the man's eyes. He just didn't move fast enough to stop it. That evening, Talia brought Kira to Maribel House. The little girl moved through the rooms with the careful curiosity of a child who had learned to read new spaces, exits, sight lines, whether the floors felt solid. She was small for 7, with her mother's focused eyes and a gravity in her expression that had no business being there at that age. Talia was sitting on the floor of the main room going through documents when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She was on her feet in a second. It was Adrian. He stopped in the doorway, registering her reaction. "I should have knocked," he said. "Yes," she said. He had a folder under his arm. He held it up. "I found the original deed. The community clause was never legitimately voided. It was reclassified by my legal team without my knowledge." A pause. "Without knowledge I should have had. What does that mean for tomorrow?" "I've delayed the demolition order by 72 hours. I'm working on something more permanent, but it involves going up against my own board. I want you to know that's what it involves. I'm not telling you it's resolved. I'm telling you I'm working on it." She hadn't expected that. The honesty of it, specifically the absence of the clean resolution she'd seen promised and retracted too many times to count. "Why?" she said. "Because my mother built that clause into the deed 30 years ago, and I signed paperwork that erased it. Because your daughter needs to know she'll have somewhere to wake up tomorrow, and she's right. And because I've spent 20 years building things in this city, and I've never once asked who had to leave so I could build them." The room was quiet. From down the hall came the sound of small footsteps, and then Kira appeared in the doorway holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She looked at Adrian without fear or particular interest. "Why is there a picture of an old lady on the wall?" Adrian's expression shifted, something loosening at the edges. He crouched down to her level. "That's my mother. She used to live here." "Where is she now?" "She passed away a few years ago." "Oh!" Kira nodded with the solemn, matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes show toward death, having not yet learned to flinch from it. "She looks nice." "She was," Adrian said. Kira looked at him for another moment, apparently satisfied, then padded back down the hallway. The rabbit's ear dragged along the floor behind her. Talia and Adrian stood in the quiet the child had left behind. No strategic distance between them in that moment, no negotiation. Just two tired adults in an old house in the middle of something neither of them had planned for. "She's not wrong," Talia said finally, looking toward the photograph. "About her looking nice." "No," Adrian said. "She's not." He said goodnight. Talia walked him to the door. After she heard the gate close, she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the empty street. The night air was warm and smelled like low tide. She went back inside and locked the door. The next morning arrived the way bad mornings do, not with a single blow, but with accumulation. Talia woke to the sound of heavy vehicles. She was at the window before she was fully awake. A construction crew was staging equipment at the end of Juniper Row, moving with the methodical efficiency of people who had been told to move quickly. Behind them, a yellow excavator was visible at the corner, engine idling. She called the number Mavis had given her. No answer. She called Adrian. It went to voicemail. A knock came at the gate, hard and official. A city contractor in a hard hat with a clipboard. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that a structural emergency order has been filed on this property. We're required to clear the premises within 2 hours." "There's a procedural review in progress," Talia said. "I have documentation." "The emergency order supersedes the review." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm sorry. We've been instructed to proceed." She understood immediately. Graham hadn't waited 72 hours. He had found a faster mechanism, an emergency structural declaration, and had moved the timeline forward while Adrian was still sleeping. It was clean, procedural, and completely effective. She went inside and got Kira up. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands steady. She packed what they had. It didn't take long because she had never fully unpacked, and she told Kira they were going to go get breakfast and see what happened next. Kira looked at her with those focused eyes and said nothing, because she was 7 years old and she already understood the shape of this kind of morning. They were on the front steps when the crew began removing the sign. Talia watched them take down Maribel. House watched the wooden letters come off the facade and get set on the grass, and she held Kira's hand and did not look away because she had learned a long time ago that looking away didn't actually make things hurt less. "Mama," Kira said. "Yeah, baby. Where are we going to sleep tonight?" 7 words. Completely reasonable. From a child who deserved an answer that didn't require her mother to hold her breath to get through it. Talia felt something give way in her chest. Not breaking, but releasing, the way a joint releases when you've been holding a weight too long and your body finally refuses. She looked down at her daughter. "We're going to figure it out," she said. It was the worst possible answer. She knew that. Kira probably knew it too, in the wordless way children know when adults are managing rather than solving. Adrian's car came around the corner just then, too late. Moving too fast, Russell pulling up hard against the curb. Adrian was out before the car fully stopped, looking at the crew at the sign on the grass, at the excavator idling at the corner. He looked at Talia. She picked up their bag, took Kira's hand, and walked toward the street. She had put enough weight down for one morning. Adrian stood on the sidewalk and watched them go. He had been too late. He had known it from the moment Russell picked up speed 3 blocks out. The sign was on the grass. The crew was moving. And Talia was walking with the particular forward momentum of someone who had learned not to stand still when the ground shifted. He turned and looked at the excavator. Then he took out his phone and called Graham. Graham picked up on the second ring. "Adrian, who authorized the emergency structural order?" A brief pause. "The building inspector filed it this morning based on the assessment report. I ensured the paperwork moved quickly. I told you 72 hours. And I told you what 72 hours costs us." "Stop the crew," Adrian said, "right now, or I will stand in front of that excavator myself and you can explain to the investors why their project lead is on the evening news." 4 seconds of silence. "I'll make a call," Graham said. The crew stood down. It took 20 minutes, 2 additional calls, and a favor Adrian had never expected to spend on something like this. The excavator engine cut out. The site supervisor accepted the hold order without visible opinion and told his crew to take an early lunch. Adrian walked into Maribel House alone. The front rooms were untouched. The photograph of his mother still hung at its slight angle on the wall. He walked past it down the narrow hallway through the kitchen and into the small room at the rear, his mother's office. A desk, a chair, a window looking over the overgrown back garden, shelves lined with folders going back decades. He had not been in this room since the funeral. The desk drawers were stiff with disuse. He opened them one by one. The first two held the expected residue of a life utility bills correspondence with the city insurance documents. The third drawer held a notebook, a standard composition notebook, black and white. His mother's handwriting on the cover in blue pen, House Records. He opened it. Dorothy M. 2 children, age 4 and 6. Lost apartment in the November storm. Needs 3 weeks minimum, possibly more. She doesn't ask for much. Make sure she knows she's not in the way. He turned the page. Renee B., running from a bad situation I don't need to write down here. She's frightened and she doesn't trust easily. Don't push. Give her the back room so she has a door she can close. Page after page. Name after name. His mother's handwriting steady and unhurried, each entry carrying the specific weight of a person being seen rather than processed. Sandra T. lost her job when the cannery closed. She has too much pride to ask twice. Offer once and mean it. Carol and her daughter, the little girl's name is Bria and she's 6 and she likes to draw. Get some paper if you can. Loretta 3 months pregnant, no one knows. She cried the first night and I let her. Sometimes that's the whole thing. Adrian sat down in his mother's chair and read. He read for a long time. The names changed, but the shape of things was consistent. Women arriving with what they could carry. Women who had learned to take up less space than they needed. Women who were somewhere between the end of one thing and the uncertain beginning of whatever came next. His mother had written about each of them, not as cases, but as people with specific preferences, particular fears, small things that made them feel less afraid. One woman needed a window that faced east because she slept better with morning light. Another couldn't be in the kitchen when the radio was on. His mother hadn't explained why. She'd written only, "She has her reasons. Turn it off." He turned to the last page. A shelter doesn't save the world, but it can keep one mother from sleeping outside tonight. That has to be enough reason. It always has been. Adrian closed the notebook. He sat in the small room in the chair that still held the faint shape of his mother's use of it, and he allowed himself to be completely still. Not the performed stillness of a man choosing his words, but actual stillness, the kind that arrives when there's nothing left to manage, and the thing you've been avoiding finally finds the opening. He had grown up in this neighborhood and left it, and built a career out of transforming places like it into things that no longer contained the people who had made them. He had not been oblivious, he had been deliberate. There was a difference, and it was worse. When he stood up, he knew what he was going to do, not with the fresh certainty of a man who had just discovered his values, but with the quieter, heavier resolution of a man who had always known them and had chosen for a long time to look somewhere else. He tucked the notebook under his arm and walked out. Graham Sutter was waiting at the Crew Harbor offices. He was not alone. 3 board members were present, along with senior legal counsel and Patricia Holt, a composed representative from the primary investment group who had flown in from New York. She looked at Adrian when he walked in with the expression of someone who had already run the numbers and didn't like them. Adrian set his mother's notebook on the conference table. Nobody touched it. "I want to talk about what we're building," he said. Graham's voice was careful. "We know what we're building. We've been building it for 3 years. We're building luxury towers on land that has housed working families for 60 years, Adrian said. We're building a marina on a waterfront where my mother ran a shelter for 2 decades because there was nowhere else for those families to go. We have language in our materials about revitalizing the community. What we mean is replacing the community with a more profitable one." "Adrian," Patricia began. "I know what it is," he said. "I've known what it is. That's the part I've been sitting with this morning." Graham leaned forward. "We cannot stop this project based on personal history. We have contractual obligations, investors, a delivery timeline." "I'm halting the demolition of Maribel House," Adrian said. The room went quiet. "The rest of the development proceeds as planned. The towers, the retail, the marina, all of it moves forward. But 14 Juniper Row is removed from the demolition schedule permanently. It will be restored and returned to its original function as a community shelter funded through a private foundation I will personally endow. That building sits in the center of the parcel, Graham said. The site plan can be redrawn. The architects have done more complicated things. The investors, I'll call them myself, this afternoon. He looked at Patricia. I'd like you to hear the revised terms before you make any decisions. He looked at Graham. You're on administrative leave effective today, pending a review of the emergency order you filed this morning. He picked up the notebook. My mother wrote down the name of every person who came through this building. Every one. She wrote what they needed, what they were afraid of, what made them feel less alone. He looked around the table. None of those people exist anywhere in our project documents. We erased them with a title clearance memo and called it standard process. He set the notebook down gently. I'm not doing that anymore. He walked out before anyone could respond. He found Mavis O'Neill at the Community Services office on Delacroix Street. She was at her desk reading, and she looked up at him over her glasses with the unhurried assessment of a woman who had been evaluating situations long enough that very few surprised her. I've been wondering when you'd come here, she said. You knew who I was, he said. When you gave Talia the key, I knew whose house it was. She closed her folder. I knew your mother. Not closely, but enough. I knew what she built and why. I also knew what happened to the deed clause. Why didn't you fight it? I did, she said simply. 3 formal objections over 5 years, all processed and denied. She looked at him steadily. A 70-year-old community services officer doesn't carry much weight against a $340 million project. You do. He sat down in the chair across from her. I stopped the demolition, he said, permanently. I'm pulling the building from the development plan. I want to restore it and reopen it as a functioning shelter. But I want governance to sit with the community, not with me. I want you involved. I want Talia involved if she's willing. I want the foundation structured so that no future board of mine can touch it. Mavis looked at him for a long moment, not with the warm relief he might have expected, but with the careful consideration of someone who had heard a great many promises and had learned to wait for the architecture behind them. That's a good plan, she said, if you mean it. I mean it. She folded her hands on the desk. Your mother said something to me once. She said the hardest part of this work wasn't the people who came through the door, it was the people who decided what the door was worth. She paused. She never said your name when she said that, but I always thought she was leaving a space for you. Adrian didn't have a response to that. He wasn't sure one was required. I'll call Talia, Mavis said. I can't promise anything on her behalf. Don't, he said. Just tell her I stopped the machines. The rest is her decision. Talia took 3 hours. She sat in a diner on the far side of Baywater with Kira and a cup of coffee she didn't drink. And she took 3 hours because she had learned at significant personal cost that the first answer her body gave her when someone offered help was not always the right one. Sometimes it was just fear wearing the shape of self-sufficiency. The two things felt identical from the inside, and the only way to tell them apart was to sit still long enough to notice the difference. She thought about the furnished apartment Adrian had offered the first morning. She thought about all the ways that kind of help had a price that didn't show up on the receipt, the soft erosion of agency, the accumulation of obligation, the way gratitude could become its own kind of debt. Then she thought about what he'd said the night before. I've spent 20 years building things in this city, and I've never once asked who had to leave so I could build them. She thought about the look on his face when Kira asked about the photograph. She thought about Mavis's message. He stopped the machines. The building stands. He says the rest is your decision. Kira was drawing on a paper napkin she had asked the waitress for a pen and was now deeply absorbed in what appeared to be a house with a large garden and several animals of indeterminate species. Mama, Kira said without looking up. Yeah. Is that place still there? The one with the picture of the lady? Talia looked at her daughter. Yes, she said. It's still there. Kira nodded satisfied and added another animal to the garden. Talia picked up her phone. She didn't go back to Maribel House that afternoon to tell Adrian she was staying. She went back because Kira wanted to show the drawing to the lady in the photograph, and you didn't argue with that kind of intention. Adrian was on the front steps when they arrived, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, ending a phone call. He looked at Talia with the careful attention of a man who understood that whatever was about to happen was entirely up to her. She walked up the path and stopped 2 feet from the steps. "I'm not a project," she said. "I know," he said, "and I'm not a story you get to tell about yourself." "I know that too. If I'm involved in this, whatever this becomes, it's because it makes sense for me and Kira, and because I have something to contribute, not because you offered." "Yes," he said. "That's the only version of this I want." She looked at the building, at the sign leaned against the wall, at the windows with their old glass at the door that a woman named Maribel Crew had opened for dozens of people who had nowhere else to go. "Mavis should chair the board," Talia said. "She knows this neighborhood. She knows the legal history. She kept this building from disappearing." "Agreed. And I want a real role. Program director. Working title, real responsibilities. A salary that reflects actual work. I know what women coming through that door need because I've been one of them. That knowledge is worth something." "It is," he said. "And yes." She looked at him steadily for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that read as performance, no relief at being forgiven, no satisfaction at having solved the problem. He looked like a man who had made a decision that cost him something real and was prepared to live with it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. From inside the house, they heard Kira's voice talking to the photograph. "She's telling your mother about the drawing," Talia said. Adrian looked at the door. Something moved through his expression and settled into something quieter. "She'd have liked that," he said. The press conference happened 2 days later on the front steps of Maribel House. Adrian stood in front of the cameras and said what he had to say. He did not use the word revitalization. He did not use the phrase community investment. He said that Maribel House would not be demolished, that it would be restored and returned to its founding purpose, that governance would sit with the community rather than with his company, and that the Crew Harbor development would proceed with a revised site plan that permanently excluded 14 Juniper Row. He said, "The woman who brought this to my attention didn't need rescuing. She showed up with a legal right, a key, and her daughter, and she held her ground against considerable pressure. What she needed, what this situation needed, was for someone with more power than her to stop taking the thing that was supposed to protect her." He did not point to Talia. He did not name her in the context of his decision. She stood to his left, slightly back next to Mavis. She wore a dark blue jacket she had borrowed from a friend. When the cameras turned toward her, she didn't smile for them. She just looked back steadily with the full weight of her own presence. That was enough. The restoration took 4 months. Mavis O'Neill oversaw the legal restructuring of the foundation, ensuring the community use clause was embedded in the new charter in language that could not be circumvented by title clearance. She signed the founding documents in the same room where Maribel Crew had once sat writing names in a notebook. Before she left that day, she sat in the old chair for a moment and let herself feel it. She had waited a long time for this. Talia moved into an apartment 2 blocks from Maribel House, paid for by her salary, and for the first time in 8 months, she unpacked completely. Every box, every drawer. Kira's drawings went up on the wall. The stuffed rabbit got a dedicated shelf. The kitchen window faced east and let in morning light. Kira stopped checking the door when she came home. It took Talia a few weeks to notice that small defensive check, the quick scan to confirm the space was still safe, simply gone. When she noticed it, she had to sit down. She sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and was quietly grateful for something she didn't have a name for, something larger than relief and smaller than happiness that felt in the best possible way like solid ground. The night before Maribel House reopened, Talia walked through it alone. The restoration had been careful. New paint, repaired floors, updated plumbing, but the character of the place had been deliberately preserved. The hallway was still narrow, The kitchen still looked out over the back garden, now cleared and planted with things that would come back year after year. The photograph of Maribel Crew was still on the wall of the main room, cleaned and reframed at the same slight angle it had always hung. The first room was made up and ready. Clean mattress, new sheets, a lamp on the small bedside table. On the pillow, a note card Talia had written herself. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. She thought about 11 blocks of cracked sidewalk and a mattress that weighed more than she had expected. She thought about a gate that opened when she pushed it. She thought about a woman she had never met who had written names in a notebook for 20 years because she believed that doing one specific thing for one specific person was always worth doing, even when it couldn't fix everything. She turned off the light and walked through the rest of the house, making sure the windows were locked. The heat was on. The place was ready. Adrian arrived the next morning before the ceremony. He stood at the gate and looked at the building, new paint, old sign. The original letters cleaned and remounted the wood, sealed but not replaced. Talia was on the steps with a coffee, and she raised the cup in a minimal greeting when she saw him. He came through the gate and stood at the base of the steps. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. Like something that should have existed the whole time, and like something that might not last, and we have to make it last anyway. He nodded. "That's about right." Behind them, the door of Maribel House was open. Mavis was arranging chairs inside, and Kira was helping in the specific unhelpful way of children who have been told they are helping and take the responsibility very seriously. The sound of small footsteps moved through the old rooms. Out on Juniper Row, the morning was coming in off the water, salt-aired, unhurried, the light hitting the old buildings at an angle that made them look for a moment like they had always been exactly where they were supposed to be. Talia set her coffee down and put her hand on the sign as she turned to go back inside. The wood was warm from the early sun. Maribel House, still standing. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it's worth saying plainly. Talia didn't need a billionaire to save her. She needed the systems around her, the legal structures, the institutions, the people with power to stop actively taking from her. There's a difference between those two things, and it matters. Adrian wasn't a bad person who became a good one. He was a person who had learned very successfully not to look at certain things. What changed wasn't his character, it was his willingness to turn and face what he already knew. And Mavis, patient, persistent, filing her third objection to a bureaucracy that had already ignored two, is the quiet center of the whole story. She didn't have leverage, she had memory, and she kept showing up anyway. Most of us will never run a $340 million development, but most of us know what it feels like to look past something uncomfortable because looking at it would require us to change something. Most of us have signed something without reading page 187. The question Maribel House asks isn't whether you have enough money to fix something. It's whether you're willing to stop long enough to see it clearly. A shelter doesn't save the world, but it can keep one mother from sleeping outside tonight. That has to be enough reason. It always has been. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it on this channel. Stories about ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things and what we can learn from them. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. And if someone in your life needs to hear something like this today, share it with them. You never know what it lands on.